Peace and good and greetings once again from the Shrine of St. Anthony, and a special word of greeting to all the companions of St. Anthony today and this weekend, and hope all are well. And just a reminder that we remember you each day in our prayers here at the Friary, each evening. So, and hopefully you keep us in your prayers as well, as we all seek to walk that road of discipleship as companions of St. Anthony. Well, today we're up to the 15th Sunday in Ordinary Time. But again, ordinary doesn't mean ordinary in the way we normally use that word of plain, boring, right? But rather it means enumerated, numbered weeks. And it's, this divided up into two pieces, but the biggest part of it is from Pentecost to the end of the year and before we get to Advent once again. And this week is the 15th Sunday in Ordinary Time. And again, ordinary in number, but not ordinary in its value and importance to us. Now, on this coming Sunday in the Gospel, we'll be hearing the story of the Good Samaritan. So the one word of encouragement I will offer to you is, oftentimes when we hear those very familiar stories from the Gospel, a man was journeying from Jerusalem down to wherever, and you hear that, you know what's coming, and yet the tendency is to change the channel, isn't it? But hopefully we stay attentive, because oftentimes when we hear these stories again, we hear something we never noted before, and that's a very special way that I think God speaks to us. In Ordinary Time, as you might know, the first reading, which is probably always, it's probably always from the Hebrew Scriptures, is thematically tied to whatever the Gospel is. So in Ordinary Time, we have a kind of a sequential reading through one of the Synoptic Gospels, and this year we're reading Luke. Right? And by the end of the year, we will have heard basically the entirety of Luke's Gospel. And each Sunday, the first reading is chosen to complement, if you will, the Gospel reading through some theme or image, right? And oftentimes, most times I would say, to understand the Hebrew Scripture reading, you need to be attentive to the Gospel. So the Gospel reading helps us to interpret the first reading, right? But this is an unusual situation, at least this is just my reading of it, right? This is an unusual time when it goes the other way around. When the first reading is very helpful in understanding the depths, if you will, of the gospel story, in this case of the Good Samaritan. And we're all familiar with that story, right? That this guy gets beat up, and he's traveling along, and he gets beat up and robbed, and the priest comes by and says, I can't stop and bother with that. Another guy comes by, can't bother with that, and a Samaritan sees this suffering soul and has compassion, and takes care of him and takes care of his need. And he is the one who is viewed as the one who is loving his neighbor. Right? We often struggle with how to live that, don't we? What does that mean to love one's neighbor? Because it's a lot more complicated, right, than it sounds initially, right? If you've ever walked through the streets of a city, probably anywhere in the world, you're going to encounter people who are in need. And for example, and they're usually looking for money. Oftentimes, the last thing people in that situation need is money, because they're not going to probably use it terribly well. So how do you address that? What do you do? Right? What do you do? All that, and I'm not going to offer an answer to that question. That's for you and your conscience to resolve, right? But what's important, though, is you feel like you want to do something. And that's key. That's the key part of that text, right? It's not so much what you do, it's kind of why you do it. And that's unpacked for us very well in the first reading, which is from Deuteronomy, right? Which is basically, its main focus really is to highlight God's giving of the law to the people of Israel, right? And that's what's going on here in the story. And Moses is talking to the people, and Moses said to the people, "If only you would heed the voice of the Lord your God and keep his commandments and statutes that are written in this book of the law, when you return to the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul." So again, this is important, right? And this is, in the language that we hear here is very similar to the language we will hear in the gospel reading, right? To return to the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul, right? How do we do that? By being faithful to the commandments and statutes that are written in this book of the law. He continues, "For this command that I enjoin on you today is not too mysterious and remote for you. It is not up in the sky that you should say, 'Who will go up in the sky and to get it for us, and tell us of it, that we may carry it out?' Nor is it across the sea that you should say, 'Who will cross the sea to get it for us, and tell us of it, that we may carry it out?'" This is very important, isn't it, right? Because we tend to overcomplicate life, don't we? Right? And by complicating it, we kind of create barriers, oftentimes within our own selves, really, of responding to God's love, responding to God's call in our lives, right? And we can make things so complicated, so mysterious, so remote that we think it's beyond us, and therefore we can give ourselves a pass on having to be seeking out what God wants in my life. Oh, this is too above me. I can't do it. But Moses continues and speaks the most important word here. No. It is something very near to you. It is something very near to you. Right? Again, the Jewish people, and as we know from the gospel stories, right, that once the law is written in the Torah, that there is this long tradition. So there are the lawyers and the scribes who interpret these texts and try to bring them together to create rather complicated systems of understanding, right? They get incredibly complex and more complex all the time, right? Think back to the priest, right, in the Samaritan story, who's afraid of being defiled, so he can't do his job, right? If he gets off his horse or whatever and stops and helps this bloody guy, he might be defiled under the law, right? And they may not be able to assist to do his ministry rather as a priest. We come back. No, it is something very near to you, already in your mouths and, critical part, in your hearts. It's already in your heart. You have only to carry it out. I think this is the critical part of this text, right? Think back to what St. Paul says, right? St. Paul says, I know what I'm supposed to do, but I don't do it sometimes. Isn't that the same for all of us? It is for me. Maybe you resonate with this as well, right? We know what we are to do. Why? Because it is written in our hearts. Right? This past week, in the United States at least, we celebrated Independence Day, right? One of the things I like to do on that day is to read the Declaration of Independence. It's a worthy read, especially the first part, the first paragraph, you might say, where Thomas Jefferson and the other founders, right, agreed to and proclaimed that there are certain inalienable rights bestowed on us by our Creator. Right? He's basically saying what we hear today, right? That there are these rights. And rights always imply obligations. There's never a right without a responsibility, correct? Right? And among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then when the Constitution comes along, the founders say, no, we need to expand that, right? And the Bill of Rights is written. Again, with the same notion, right? These are not rights and responsibilities given to us by the government. They are given to us by the Creator, right? And they are written in our hearts, right? We know what we're supposed to do. But oftentimes we make it overcomplicated, or we simply just don't do it. The great Christian apologist and writer, fantasy writer too, he's more noted that way, C.S. Lewis, we might have mentioned this in these series before, but C.S. Lewis during World War II was asked to do some kind of Christian apologetic talks on the BBC for a popular audience, right? And he was talking about this very topic, right, which we call the natural law, right? This understanding that even without revelation, right, we in our hearts, we know what we're supposed to do as human beings, right? And he picked out a very simple image to prove that this is true, right? And the image he used was riding on a bus. You're riding on a bus, and the bus is going, and there's this old lady, perhaps, and she's trundling down the aisle looking for a seat, and the bus stops short or whatever, and she starts to fall. What do you do? Without even thinking about it, you reach out to help. That's what we're talking about here, right? We know what we're supposed to do. We know what the responsibility of the law is, right? We have been given these great rights of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and on, self-defense, the right to be judged fairly, the right not to have to incriminate oneself. These are all gifts from God, not the government, right? Or any person, right? But there's a responsibility that comes with them, right? And therefore, that's how we fulfill the Good Samaritan. We can often get caught up with these great cosmic causes, these great notions, but the reality is we need to begin to do this in our own worlds, in our own places, with the people that we encounter each day. As the old saying goes, charity begins at home, right? We ask the Lord to help us with that, to help us to be the Good Samaritan, to be the good neighbor, the loving neighbor to those we encounter each day. Well, thank you for joining us today for our reflection on the readings this week of the 15th, Sunday in Ordinary Time. Hopefully we'll be back next week. Keep us in your prayers. Know that you are in ours. So until next time, peace and good from all of us here at the Shrine of St. Anthony.